Welcome back, everyone, to a new episode of Governance This Week. I'm very happy to have Philip Stevens here in the studio, contributing editor of the Financial Times. Great to have you, Philip.
Great to be back. Thank you.
Today, we're looking at the latest developments on the global scene, and we'll look, among other things, at China and Ukraine, King Charles and his coronation, Assad, among other things. So stay with us in the next minutes. But let's start with China and the war in Ukraine, Philip. Xi Jinping called up President Zelensky, talking about peace mediation and proposing to send a delegation actually to Ukraine. How serious is Beijing about mediation?
Well, this is the sort of $64,000 question, as it were, that everyone from sort of Washington to Kyiv, obviously, but Paris and Moscow is answering. But I think what it's shown, I think the fact that President Xi eventually made that telephone call is now talking about appointing an envoy to see whether there's mediation, tells us that China wants to do something, or at least wants to be seen to be doing something, and it feels uncomfortable in its present position. It's supported Vladimir Putin all the way through, except but it has been, although they talk about a partnership without limits, there are clearly limits because China isn't supplying Russia with ammunition and weaponry for the war. But Beijing is clearly sort of torn by this conflict. On the one hand, a confrontation with the West, which challenges the old order, as it were, what's seen in Beijing as the old Western order, is good. On the other hand, a war which, one, Russia is losing, and two, which has really turned its sort of closest ally into a sort of pariah state around the world. We see that now that Putin can't even travel to South Africa for a meeting of the BRICS, because he risks being arrested under a warrant from the International Criminal Court. China wants to sort of pull away from that. So, China has a different strategy from Russia towards the West, as it were. Russia sees the US and Europe essentially as one. Europe as basically doing what the US tells it to. China's always taken the view that actually it has an adversary in the US, but if not an ally, then a sort of neutral in Europe. And China has been trying over time to pull back a bit from the hawkish behaviour we saw a couple of years ago towards Europe and rebuild bridges. And this war clearly prevents that and is a clear block. So she would like to see a resolution. How far China will go in, if you like, pushing Putin in that direction, or presenting potential, I was going to say solutions, but I don't think solutions is the word, but potential frameworks for at least peace talks, we're not quite clear. But as I say, it tells us that China feels it needs to be engaged. It can't just stand on the sidelines, which, in a way is progress, small progress, but progress.
So we'll see what happens on that front, and also, how other nations react to this initiative, and also, of course, how successful it will be.
Just one more thing on this, because having said it's going to do this, now China is going to be tested against this. So European states are going to be saying, okay, well, let's see. So in a way, China now has put itself in a position where, it can't just walk away again. So it's, I think China is under some pressure. I think she's under some pressure. Sorry.
No, absolutely. Good addition there. We're going to completely change topic now and talk about the United Kingdom, where on Saturday, King Charles III will be coronated. So I'd like to know from you, Philip, what does all the pomp and pageantry tell us about a nation which, let's say, has had some difficult times post-Brexit?
Well, really quite difficult times. And I think the one thing that Britain is good at is pomp and pageantry and great national events such as this, with the sort of the military, the golden carriages, the music, and the tradition of Westminster. So it's good, and I think it makes Britain feel good, and Britain is going through a very tough time economically at the moment. Cost of living crisis felt everywhere. I think it's felt more acutely in Britain than in much of the rest of Europe, mostly because of the self-inflicted wound of Brexit. People are beginning to regret that. So we'll have this sort of national celebration, but in a way it's also the monarchy and the way we treat it. I mean, the way the Brits treat it is really a sort of metaphor for the sort of fundamental problem that Britain's had over the last many decades. In fact, since the end of empire after the Second World War, which is the monarchy represents what we'd like to be in all its pomp and grandeur. But there's that self-perception is quite distant from the reality of a power, still a significant power, a big economy, but a power that is, has lost ground against other great powers in the world and has really become a middle-sized European state. So that gap between the sort of self-perception and the sort of glory and grandeur of the monarchy and the reality of quite tough economic times, of a nation that can't really punch above its weight on the world stage anymore, is a difficult one. This coronation won't be anything like, of course, that of the late Queen Elizabeth in 1953. I mean, Britain still had a significant empire at that point, but it will still be rather grand. I'm not quite sure, though, that once the weekend has passed and everyone will enjoy it and have street parties and festivals, whether people will begin to see whether this rather large, expensive monarchy with a king with more than a dozen palaces is really quite suited to the sort of realities of Britain's economic and international status. So, yes, a fun weekend, yes, a sort of celebration, but I think there may be something of a hangover.
Yeah, I can imagine. But allow me to add a little bit of a speculative question here. Of course, there are hundreds, if maybe thousands, of people flying in, including heads of state, prime ministers, royals from all over the world. It is actually also a place where some business can be done, where some important global issues can be discussed.
Yes, and there are, as you say, presidents and heads of state from across the world. Not all of them. Joe Biden isn't going. He'll be represented by his wife. But I think President Macron will be there. I mean, some of the other heads of states, of course, are sort of titular heads of states rather than heads of government as well. So, the Emperor of Japan. So, but there undoubtedly will be business done in the margins. And Britain, which internationally has seen its reputation rather tarnished in recent years, people like Boris Johnson not really treated seriously on the international stage, and indeed not trusted. So a lot of work will go into, I think, trying to rebuild some of the relationships which became difficult in recent years. So there will be that dimension to it. But I mean, the truth is that no other European country with a monarchy has coronations anymore. It's it's an oddity. I think the only other rich democracy with a monarchy that has such an event is Japan, indeed. I think so. I wonder whether this will be the last such sort of grand event, or whether after it, Prince Charles might have to think hard about. People talk about modernising. What they really mean is slimming down our monarchy.
I'm sure that millions of people around the world will tune in on Saturday to have a look, and I admit I will try to at least get a glimpse of what is happening there as well. As we continue our trip around the world to see what is in the news, we have to also talk for a moment about the Middle East, where it seems that in recent months, and there's been quite some reporting about that, that somehow the regime of Bashar al-Assad is being rehabilitated. What do you make of that, Philip?
Well, that's exactly, I mean, you're exactly right. He is being rehabilitated. I mean, 10, 12 years ago, he was a pariah in the Arab world as well as in the West. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, all these countries disavowed his regime. What we've seen is in recent months is the beginning of a process of rehabilitation. He visited the United Arab Emirates a couple of months back and was given the red carpet treatment. The Syrian foreign minister has been to Riyadh and the Saudi foreign minister to Damascus. So there's a process going on which is to, if you like, bring him back into the Arab world. It's not without its problems, and I'm sure that there'll be conditions. But this is, I think, a sign of a new Middle East emerging from what I would call the American, if not retreat, from America stepping back from the region, because it fits with other changes. We saw, for example, China mediating between Saudi Arabia and Iran to ease some of the tensions in that relationship. Now, that would have been an extraordinary thing to think about, just even a year or two ago. What's China doing? This is America's sort of territory, as it were. And we're, I think, moving into a Middle East now where Arab countries, and particularly the Saudis and the Emiratis, but also others, are asserting more independent foreign policies. They've decided whatever they think of Assad and whatever the West thinks of Assad, he's staying there, and it's easier to deal with him than not. There are some particular problems. I mean, there are some big problems about refugees, about the drugs trade in Syria, about the remnants of ISIS, the terrorism that they believe might be better settled with Assad brought back in. So I think the next step is, the question is whether he will be readmitted to the Arab League.
Yeah.
That's being discussed. I don't think it's decided, but that's certainly the direction we're heading, and we're heading in a direction where of Middle East where America no longer decides.
Yeah. And what does that say about the role of human rights in this region, actually? If Arab states really reaffirm their role in this way, take their place on the international scene, what does it say about the meaning of human rights, considering what has been happening for over a decade in Syria?
Well, this is the world of realpolitik, and in a way, I think this is the world that we're heading into. Not just in the Middle East, but across many parts of the globe, where some of the expectations that Western democracies had, that they could, if you like, export their values and set parameters for relationships with some of these countries which focused on human rights, is under challenge, and I think will continue. And I think we're going to talk about the world we share, which was a seminar symposium we had here just last week, talking about the new geopolitical map that's emerging. And I think the Middle East is part of that, because if we'll go on about what I think we learned from this event was that we can no longer think of the world in terms of power blocks. It's no longer democracies versus autocracies, or China versus the US. I think we have to think of a world in which the sort of global landscape is overlaid with regional arrangements in which middle powers, the Saudi Arabias, the Turkeys, and in Southeast Asia, the Japans, and make more of their own choices, and that is what this is the world we haven't got a picture yet of this new landscape, but whereas, not so long ago people were talking about the world being flat, this new landscape has got lots of mountains and ravines and difficult obstacles. So I think the Middle East is part of that global picture in which, we're a bit, perhaps we could call it no man's land now, between the old sort of, we had the binary worlds, a bipolar world of the Soviet Union versus the US, then we had US hegemony. Now we're going to have a much more complicated, messy, untidy world of competing powers, and in which, powers are in one camp for one set of purposes and another camp for another. One of our speakers gave a very good metaphor, I thought, last week for groupings of nations who form themselves into limited liability partnerships, rather like lawyers who get together to perform a particular function, but it's not an alliance that covers everything, and I think that's the world we're into. So the Saudis, for example, will keep buying their arms from the US, but will deal diplomatically with China.
Yeah. Now, this event you've been mentioning, the world we share here at the School of Transnational Governance, was fascinating indeed. I managed to take part in it, and one thing that also struck me was that there was reference to the fact that the European Union and Europe as a whole should also be quite modest in kind of reaffirming its position on the global stage, also in light of these developments. It's not a matter of United States, China as superpowers and trying to be just like them, but also kind of to assert a different kind of influence. What can you say about that?
Yeah, I think there's a general consensus that Europe still has to do more to turn its economic power into geopolitical power, and it shouldn't try, to be different from the US just for the sake of being different, as it were. I mean, but should recognise that our interests don't coincide, but also recognise, responsibilities in our own neighbourhood. I think one of the points that was made very forcefully about, opportunity lost during the pandemic, Europe could have looked to Africa and said, look, we are going to take responsibility here. We are going to vaccinate Africa. That would have been a huge, if you like, exertion of European values and power. And I think the view was that Europe has to think more smartly about not just going to these countries and saying, look, we expect you to do this or we expect you to do that. This is what you can do, and this is how we will help and engage with you and partner you to do things, rather than talking down to some of these nations, as I think some Europeans have done in the past.
Yeah. Well, Philip, loads of developments around the world, many of which were captured in this event, and that's definitely the conversation that will continue here at the school, and hopefully also in this series. We hope to have you back next time when you return to Florence. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been great.
We'll connect again soon, and thank you to all our viewers for joining. Don't forget to subscribe and to leave your questions and comments. Thanks a lot for your attention.